Where are you?
Denver, or outside of Denver. I live in the mountains, and we are getting hammered with snow right now. So hopefully, internet will be stable, and if it's not, we will deal with that as it happens. But yeah, it is really, really coming down right now.
Oh boy. How long have you been there?
I've been in this house for 7 years. I was born in Colorado, though. And so, yeah, my father's family was in San Luis, Colorado when it was San Luis, Mexico. So, like, the part of Mexico we're from is Colorado.
Hmm.
Well, because they were running from the Inquisition, right? So, you always wanted to be on the very edge of the empire. So, like, founding family of Santa Fe in 1608, Abiquiu in 1620, San Luis by 1700s.
And then before that, like Portugal or Spain proper? Yeah.
Yeah, Portugal, Coimbra.
Always Gomez, or was there a name?
Always Gomez. It used to end with an S. They changed it to a Z because S was a Sephardic Jewish spelling, whereas ending it with a Z meant that it was potentially just Spanish, right? So there's vanishingly few Gomez's left that have it with an S, because it was illegal to be. If you could get out of Portugal before they did the forced conversion, it was not illegal to be Jewish, right? But once they forced you to convert, uh, then if you continued to practice Judaism, then it was illegal. And so, yeah, I have copies. The originals are in Santa Fe, but yeah, one of my ancestors was arrested by the Inquisition in Santa Fe for being a Jew.
Wow.
Yeah,
So you missed the conversion. You missed utter destruction. You kept moving. The families kept moving. What did they hold on to?
yeah. I mean, not a ton. There were always these sort of rumors in my father's side of the family. But my father was raised very disconnected from both his Sephardic Jewish heritage and also from his Native American heritage, right? So it was this is my theory, but when you look at these families that were Sephardi, they very often married other families that might have been Sephardi or Native Americans. I think because it was safer than marrying a Catholic, right? So if you're a Jewish man who's being raised secretly Jewish, and you marry a Native American woman, hey, once a year we both go to church, right? You do your thing, I do my thing. We build a life together. I really think that was part of the dynamic. I do, because if you look at the marriage records, it's shocking how often these crypto Jew families were marrying into Native American.
So everyone on the margins of white culture still, being able to mix and mingle and
Right,
hang out with each other.
right. And also always on the edge of the empire, right? So you didn't want to be in Mexico City because then you would end up like the Carvajals, who I'm also a descendant of, not Louis de Carvajal, the main person who was like the center of that trial, but his father's brother is one of my ancestors, right? So he's not in my direct line, but I do have Carvajal ancestry. Uh, and yeah, he had a little, he had a little prayer book they caught him with, so that side of the family, there's no question. Like he went, to his, he was facing execution. He ended up throwing himself out of a window of the office of the Inquisition, is the story. How often the stories about suicide are true, or how often the office of the Inquisition used that to explain away the fact that they had tortured someone to death, which they were not supposed to do, right? The whole idea was they could like torture you to confess, but they weren't supposed to torture you to death. But that's the story. And yeah, they found his prayer book. He was very public about my family. My father was forced to convert. We never chose this. I'm a Jew. Uh, and so, yeah, I have that Carvajal ancestry as well. And then my mother's family is Ashkenazi. So I was primarily raised Ashkenazi. I mean, that was my father was so disconnected from his Jewish ancestry that he actually did like a formal conversion process as an adult. He wanted to be Jewish again. And so converted, married my mother. Reconverted is a term that people are now starting to use. In the 80s, that was not part of the narrative, right? But very much converted with this understanding of like there was this ancestry. So reconversion, I think, is appropriate, right? I mean, I think that's an appropriate terminology, particularly when you're talking about people who didn't leave Judaism,
Right.
right? They were forced out of Judaism by what was arguably the most powerful government in the world at that time, right? I mean, the Spanish and Portuguese Empire, if you ever go to old churches in Portugal or Spain, you rapidly realize the idea that they owned half the world is not a joke. Like, it's reflected in the opulence of their churches from that time, where, you know, there's a reason that the majority of people who speak Portugal are in Brazil, right? There's far more Portuguese speakers in the, you know, quote unquote New World than there are in Portugal. And that's just a reflection of the fact that a bunch of guys in Europe drew lines on a map and divided the world. And it worked. I mean, I think that's the most astonishing thing, is that it took so long to throw off that yoke of colonial power. You know, I think there's countries in Africa that stopped being Portuguese and French and Italian colonies like in the 60s, like the 1960s. You know, and so this was really the norm for just hundreds and hundreds of years, is that this little section of Iberia, Sepharad, you know, where Jews had been since before the Babylonian exile. I mean, those Jewish communities don't date to the exile. These were traders who had set up colonies in Europe as part of like the spice trade and the wood trade and all of these things before the exile. And so, if you look genetically at Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, they form really distinct clusters, right? They all share Y DNA links to the Levant. I mean, that's where, you know, all of our origins lie. But we were separated for so long that, that's we're very distinct clusters, except for those of us like me who, you know, we're the mishmash is happening now, I think, particularly in Israel.
Yeah,
Right?
the roots start growing. The roots start growing upwards and out at some point.
Oh yeah. What are those trees that do that? They're in Florida. The cypress trees, right? It's the
So you, this living cypress of all of these histories and stories and you know, pockets of resilience and resistance. You know, the first time that we met, it was out here in San Francisco, and you know, the first thing that you asked me or you told me about was your time in Aish Torah in Jerusalem. Like, how did you get from Colorado and your lineage to studying Torah in this particular place?
yeah. So my mother lived in Israel during the 60s and
Mm.
70s, and so I grew up often hearing these stories. And my mother's family, we have everything from Reform Jews. I mean, I primarily grew up in like a Reform synagogue to Haredi. I mean, like all the way as far as it goes. Uh, and so I was exposed to a really broad swath of Judaism growing up. Right. I mean, I would go spend. I always thought of them as summers, but I know it was winters. But I'd go from Colorado to Miami to see my grandparents, and my memories were always of it being so hot
Mm.
that I thought I was spending my summers there. But it was definitely winters. I was going to Miami, and so I mean, grew up around you know, Miami Jewish culture, which obviously has everything, right, from humanistic Judaism all the way to, you know, the sort of Temple Mount faithful level of Haredi, like these folks who think that we should destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the third temple, and they're building the third temple, right? I mean, it's a collapsible building that is in warehouses in Jerusalem.
Ready to go.
Yeah, ready to go. I mean, they could put it up in a weekend. They're planning to put it up in a weekend, right? I mean, that's the reality. And so, when I turned 18, I really wanted to go overseas. I had some money from my bar mitzvah. My parents very smartly did not really let me touch most of that money. So some of it I had going through high school, but the majority of it was thrown into a bank account that I did not have access to. And I'm tremendously thankful for that, because God knows what I would have spent it on. Or maybe I would have spent it on Magic the Gatherings cards, and I'd, you know, have a $1 million Magic collection. I have no idea. So I sold my car. I knew I was going for quite a long time, and first went to Israel in '99 on a 4-month birthright program. So it was one of the longer birthright programs. They place you on a kibbutz. You don't actually know which kibbutz until like a few days before you get to Israel. Like, it's really felt very last minute in my mind. I'm not sure if that was the case or if that was an intentional decision to like not let you, you know, dive too deeply before you landed. And so I ended up on Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, which is right between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, right? It's quite close to
Yeah.
Jerusalem. probably walkable if you were a slightly different human than me. I often did not walk. I would take the bus. Uh, and so, yeah, I would spend a lot of my free time in both Jerusalem and Bethlehem. This was before the entirety of the wall was built,
Right.
right? This was pre-Second Intifada. There was some security infrastructure between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. I do remember having to go like through, but I think that was mostly around private property issues. I don't think it was like the security wall. I remember tall fences, but I don't remember like the concrete wall that trip. Um, and so, yeah, I would like often walk into Bethlehem or take the bus into Jerusalem. Uh, and at the time, I'd been bar mitzvahed, of course, and like, I grew up in this family. Uh, I didn't really think of myself as particularly religious. I mean, Jewish morality still to this day, like, is the fundamental core of who I am and how I navigate the world and what I believe. But I didn't think of myself as particularly religious. I went to synagogue because my mother was the president of the Hebrew Day School. It was not really an option to not go to synagogue, obviously. But I have this memory of on Yom Kippur, like sneaking out to walk to the Burger King, and just like the entire thing was filled with people from our synagogue, right? I mean, it was like, and like people who were like publicly quite religious. It was
Yeah.
really a moment of a realization
Was
that,
that comforting, or was that like as a child looking at hypocrisy?
yeah, I think a little bit of both. I think, the idea that being in community sometimes requires compromise on your public and private life,
Hmm.
right? Depending on the community. But that's true of most communities, right? There's generally most communities, there's some sort of compromise that takes place between your private and public life. And I don't know if that's necessarily hypocrisy. I think it can be. I also think that that's just how humans relate to the world, right? There's I forget who wrote it, but there was some science fiction story about humans all developing telepathy for a day, and it like destroys society, right? Like suddenly this ability to like know what a person's true inner thoughts are like completely demolishes the nature of society. And I think that's largely true. I don't think society could survive if all humans became telepathic for a day. I think that would be a tremendous problem for the vast majority of people in every given culture.
Yeah, I meant
um,
just the hypocrisy of a child sometimes, seeing things in more binaries and not necessarily the sophisticated nuance that you're sharing.
yeah, so growing up as a child, I my parents sent me to a lab school, which yeah, a thing that I really would love to see expanded in this country. Seems unlikely, but it's kindergarten through college on a single campus. All of the teachers are college teachers, so even in kindergarten, I had college professors in our classrooms. Often very self-directed learning. If you were interested in something, they would encourage you to just like dive as deeply into it as you possibly could. And so, yeah, grew up really in a sort of intellectually curious environment where I was encouraged to sort of be as adult as I wanted to be. And then my dad got a job in Florida, and I got dropped into a public school in Florida in the fifth grade. And it was a bit of a problem. I don't think I ever actually fully recovered from that until college, when I went to New College of Florida, which has a similar sort of you can create your own degrees, or had, now that DeSantis is trying to basically destroy it. But at the time, you could create your own degrees, you could create your own classes, you could create your own programs of study. And in the founding docs of New College is this principle that in the final analysis, every student is responsible for their own education. And so it was really from fifth grade till college, I was missing that, but that was a part of my very young life, and then a part of my college career as well. And it really is an idea worth diving into for how we run education.
So with this background and, hopping between Bethlehem and downtown Jerusalem and the old city.
Yeah, so I went to the Kotel, and the Kotel got me, right? The guys who asked, have you wrapped tefillin today? I had not. I had not, in fact, wrapped tefillin in probably, I think, the entire 3-4 months I'd been in Israel. I had not been in a synagogue. I had not really prayed. Uh, so I did, and ended up speaking for quite a long time with somebody who was there but wasn't there with the guys asking to wrap the fill in. We just sort of connected and started talking. At the time, he was quite a young rabbi, not really established, not really well known, but it was
Mm.
Yaakov Glazier. And so by sort of pure happenstance, ended up in this long conversation with Yom Tov, who has a sort of well-deserved reputation as like a relatively psychedelic human. Like speaking with him is sort of a consciousness-altering experience. He grew up sort of in hippie community, still surfs. So, the surfing rabbi, although now much more the singing rabbi. And is one of those people who I genuinely believe if we all gain telepathy for a day, not a single thought about him would change. I think he is privately and publicly the same person. Like that is who he is. And I find that, obviously you never know what's going on in another person's mind, but he's a really deep and interesting and mystical human who I really enjoyed spending time with. And so when it came time for the end of my time at Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, I was done picking apples and making desserts in the hotel. Those were my two kibbutz jobs. I found a 3-week archaeology program where you could volunteer on a dig. So I was doing that for a few weeks. Tel Marisha, which is a really very unknown but really awesome archaeological site.
Where's that exactly? Outside of Jerusalem?
No, it's northern, I believe. It was a long time ago, but I think it's a little north. Because it's one of the areas where they find evidence of Asherah worship quite late into the Second Temple period, right? So in very, very early Judaism, the evidence is now quite strong that God had a wife, right? There was Asherah was his wife. It was during the Hezekiah reforms that was really like stamped out by Hezekiah, who was trying to centralize worship in Jerusalem. He destroyed all of these like rural temples.
Textual evidence, and it's corroborated by the archaeological record. Don't get that so often.
And also when you read the Torah and you separate out the storylines, right? There's the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh storyline and then the Elohim storyline. There are clearly two different narratives that are mashed together in the Torah. And in the Elohim storyline, you don't see claims of monotheism, you see claims of monolateralism. Right? You could only worship one God, but you never see a denial of the existence of other gods.
We have that in
right? I mean, even Elohim.
In this week's Parsha, right? And we're recording during Parshat Beshalach, but we're recording for Purim, Mi kamocha ba elim Adonai, who is like you amongst the elim, amongst the divine retinue, meaning the existence of the retinue is right there, but only that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh stands above all of them.
Right. And for anyone who's interested in this, I know we're getting way off the subject, but the Bible on Earth the Bible on Earth is a spectacular book on the sort of archaeological evidence of how Judaism changed over time within the sort of indigenous development within Canaan, because it's quite clear that this was a local religious movement, right? You don't see any evidence in the archaeological record of like a Jewish invasion into Canaan, even though that is the narrative that was presented by the Hezekiah reforms, right? That narrative was written quite late in Judaism and doesn't really match the historical evidence. And I find all of this so fascinating for a lot of reasons. But one of the big ones is that figuring out what Judaism has meant over time, I think allows us a window into what we wish to be Judaism, right? At this point, I substantially consider myself a humanistic Jew. I believe in the principles and the moral foundations of Judaism. I am obviously far less convinced of the sort of divine authorship or inspiration of the Torah. I think that the Torah was a product of a specific time and place and a specific political agenda, right? I mean, it's a political treaty by Hezekiah about why worship should be centralized in Jerusalem, presents an image of the size of the kingdom of Judea that is almost certainly just historically not true. There was clearly a Judean kingdom. I mean, we find evidence all the time, but we find it in Jerusalem and the environs, right? We don't find evidence of this Judean kingdom in Iraq, right? Which is like what the textual claim is within the Torah, is that it was, basically the Euphrates out, and so we don't find any evidence of that.
We
Uh,
haven't
and
yet,
so yeah, it's
but
we
yeah.
haven't yet. We haven't yet. And God knows if they found something, if Iraqi archaeologists found something in Iraq, I do not know if that would be public information, in the same way that if we found evidence of the things I'm talking about, right, about Hezekiah doing these edits, I'm not 100% sure how that would trickle out either if it was found in the current political climate within Israel. And so, yes, but yes, I think that the reading the Torah as a document that is a product of a time and place is appropriate. But also, I think that, reading the massive body of Jewish literature that has grown up around the Torah, that deals far more with ethics than the Torah itself often does, right? I mean, the Torah is often more a history book and a law book. It doesn't really dive deeply into the why. The why is because Hashem said to, right? I mean, that's the sort of extent of the why often within the Torah. But we have all of these midrashim that are, I genuinely believe this, the greatest sort of self-contained moral code that has been developed by man so far. It is a moral code that, if followed, does provide tremendous value both to the individual and to community as a whole. And so, even though I have mezuzahs on my doors, I consider myself a Jew. I don't pray over my food before I eat, right? Although it is a practice that I've actually been considering sort of reincorporating, mostly as a mindfulness practice around the remembrance that even as a vegetarian, my sustenance causes harm, right? Like the way that we run agriculture, my ability to eat causes harm to the world. And so, as a sort of mindfulness practice around the importance of remembering that our mere existence creates harm, and so we have an obligation to mitigate that harm by providing value to the world, I think is a really powerful practice, and one that again, that's not a modern take on Jewish existence, right? This idea that God created the world and then handed it to humanity, right? Whereas within the Christian tradition, there's sort of this idea that like God is the caretaker of the world. This is one of the many areas where there really is no Judeo-Christian tradition. There's a Judeo-Islamic tradition, right? Judaism and Islam agree perfectly on this point, that the world was created and then the stewardship of the world was given to humanity. This is, I think, actually, interestingly, one of the areas where I didn't realize as I moved into harm reduction how deeply Judaism was informing my beliefs around drug policy and harm reduction. But this is one of those areas where I think it really shows up, right? I mean, the fact that thoughts and prayers within Judaism without action is a sin, right? You don't get to just pray about a problem. You actually have a moral obligation to fix the problem, or you have sinned. Hold on, I can do this.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah, yeah.
yeah, there we go. Sorry,
You're doing
it's been a
great.
long time since yeshiva. And so yeah, if you the immediate commandment is, if you make a prayer over food and then you don't immediately eat the food, you've sinned. But that principle, like everything in Judaism, right? Here's the specific, you can't cook a baby goat in his mother's milk. And now suddenly we build a fence around this, right? And suddenly you can't use the same dishes for meat and cheese, from that original principle of not cooking a goat in its mother's milk, which to me actually reads as a prohibition against needless cruelty. Right? Like that's how it reads to me, and always has, not as a dietary restriction. The restriction is actually on being needlessly cruel. But this idea that we have this problem in society, like we'll just like we'll let God take care of it, we'll let government take care of it, right? Doesn't fly in Judaism. We each as individuals, once we have identified a problem within society, are commanded to work towards its resolution, both because of tikkun olam, but also because of this idea of you can't do a blessing without doing the thing. And blessings in Judaism have always read to me as not so much an ask for intercession
Mm.
from the divine, right? I mean, I think that's how in a Christian, we're all raised in the milieu of Christianity in America, whether or not we were raised Jewish. And when people say like, "Oh, I prayed for this," or "I blessed this," in Christianity, you are asking the divine for direct
Intercession.
intercession, direct
Yeah.
involvement. Yeah, direct involvement in the thing. In Judaism, that's not really what prayers are, right? I mean, the prayers are our reminder, our acknowledgement of Hashem has created this thing and we are now able to use it to survive. And so we are simply acknowledging the reality that I'm doing the
I love
yeshiva hand
it.
thing. As soon
I'm
as I
loving
start
it,
talking
man.
about Judaism, as soon as I
You're
start
having
talking,
a
I never
full
do this on
blown
any other subject.
somatic experience.
Yeah, I get into Judaism, and then, yeah, but it's this acknowledgement of the connection between us as individuals, the world as the place which allows us as individuals to exist, and a reminder that because we have been blessed, right? We're not blessing the food, we have been blessed
Mm.
with the food. And so that's really the direction of uh of
Yeah.
brachot within Judaism, of prayers within
And even
Judaism.
the statement of need and the admission of lack, right? Regardless of where the fulfillment of it comes from, to be able to express one's needs as having value, and there's the dignity enough that one's needs could be fulfilled and asked for, feels like a, regardless of where one is with regards to the power of divinity, humanist or otherwise, could also be a very just a powerful notion and practice.
Yeah, yeah, I think just in general as a species, I think it's easy for us to go to
Mm.
autopilot, right? It's easy for us to sort of start moving through the world without thinking
Mm.
about the world. And the Torah and the Midrashim around it, and the whole thing, the whole system of Judaism, um, at its heart is a focusing lens on our need to provide value to the world, uh, our obligation uh, to provide value to the world. And it's something that existed so deeply within my consciousness, uh, this idea that we have an obligation to repair the world, that I didn't really connect it to how I had been academically and professionally moving towards
Mm.
ending drug harms. But the more I've been, I've spoken about this a few times now. There was the Jewish Psychedelic Conference a few years ago, which I believe is how we first became aware of each other. Was through that Jewish Psychedelic Conference, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
Uh, it really is like this idea of tikkun olam sits really really deeply in how I think about drugs and drug harms, uh, and the ideas around pikuach nefesh, right? This idea that within Judaism we have not only the ability but the requirement to break any law to save a life, right? This is not just an
Right.
option; it is a
Even something
commandment.
as severe as Shabbat, if you see that someone is in threat of losing their life, one can basically um, cast off every mitzvah, every commandment in order to save that person's life.
Right, and obviously within Judaism, mitzvot are much higher obligations than temporal governmental laws,
Yeah.
right? And so if we have an obligation to break any mitzvah or any prohibition to save a life, certainly we are required to violate the laws of man to save a life. Uh, and so, the fact that many of the services that are provided within harm reduction are not legal, right? I mean, there are underground safe use facilities all over this country, people who are running spaces where people can come and use opiates under, quasi medical supervision. Uh, that is a crime. And as a Jew, I have no choice but to view that as a justified violation of the law because
Mm.
of pikuach nefesh. The test kits are considered drug paraphernalia in 30 some odd states, right? I might be the most arrestable person in drug policy. Like if a DA really wanted to push this issue, it would be very, very easy to order a test kit, file an arrest warrant, and I would be happy to have this conversation in front of a jury, right, about my religious and moral obligation to save a life. And I've never been able to find any historical evidence of this, but within Western common law, there is this idea of a necessity defense. And I think this may have come from Judaism because it seems unlikely to have come from Christianity. And so it's this idea that if you broke a law to save a life within, this is US law all the way back to British common law, that's how old this principle is, it is an affirmative defense in court. It does not prevent you from being arrested or charged, but is a thing you can say to a jury as, yes, I broke the law. My defense for that breaking of the law is that it was required to save a life. This shows up most often when people run red lights to get to hospitals, right? This is a necessity defense within that behavior. If you were running a red light to get somebody to a hospital because the level of emergency rose to that severity, you can present that in court as a reason why running that red light was not actually illegal. And so, yeah, that's always been the plan. It just seems vanishingly unlikely and less likely every year it's going to come up. The fentanyl adulteration crisis has really changed the conversation around drug checking and changed the conversation around harm reduction in a way that actually makes me quite uncomfortable. We should have been proactive around this, right? When it was poor, people of color primarily dying from opiates, that conversation was not happening. The idea that we would open safe use facilities was talked about as like enabling junkies, right? I mean, that was the language. And now that it's like rich white kids dying from fentanyl and cocaine, suddenly it's not an epidemic, it's or not a scourge, it's an epidemic, right? It's moved into like this public health language. This language shift that has happened, despite the fact that there has not been a commensurate policy shift, right? We have not yet seen the public health officials, certainly at the federal level, navigate this in the way that I think it needs to be navigated. I love drug checking as a service. I love setting up at events and testing people's drugs. It's super fun. It provides a really good window to talk about drugs in a super honest way. And it is also just literally shoveling the ocean with a fork when it comes to misrepresentation. This is all drug deaths combined. The numbers are not yet out for 2023, but I've seen the trends and I've seen some of the preliminary data. And I think for 2023, we will have lost 3 times as many people to drug deaths as we did to AIDS in the peak year of the HIV crisis. Right? We were talking about a massive public health crisis. For people under the age of 40, drug deaths were the leading cause of death in all 50 states during COVID, right? Like during a separate massive public health crisis that was killing people, drugs were still the leading cause of death for people under the age of 40 in all 50 states. It is the leading cause of death overall in some states, which is astonishing when you look at the sort of age demographics of our population and the sort of aging boomer generation, which is now starting to pass away. This is not a thing that nonprofits can fix, like, period. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try in the same way that nonprofits probably cannot fix homelessness, right? That doesn't mean you don't have nonprofits addressing the problem. But what I am saying is that the scale of the problem of drug adulteration and drug misrepresentation and drug deaths overall is one that requires a coordinated, federally funded public health response. And ultimately, I don't think it is solvable without not just decriminalization, but the legalization of drug sales. I think that providing people with the drugs they want through some sort of regulated model is likely our only way out of this. Which is a politically heavy lift, right? The idea that we're going to sell cocaine and heroin through some sort of regulated, whether that's, I don't think having it be as like a for-profit system, the way that cannabis was done, is appropriate at all. I'm not asking to see cocaine billboards, as funny as it would be, right? But
Florida, your home state, sounds like a
Florida's ready to go, right? I mean, you got that highway coming out of Miami across the Alligator Alley, like just put, it's good to go. And like, honestly, for that city, they might as well. I don't think it would increase use any in Miami. I think everyone who is in Miami who wants to use cocaine today is using cocaine today. And so I don't think prohibition actually does anything when it comes to affecting use. Actually, that's not true. I think there's probably a small percentage of people who just don't do things that aren't legal. I do think that if we legalize drug sales across the board, we would see a small increase in use. I don't actually care about the number of people who use drugs. I care
Right.
about drug harms, right? In the same way that I don't care who a person marries, right? Like that is just not a sphere of influence in another person's life that I believe is an appropriate use of state power. And I feel the exact same way about drug use. I simply don't think it is an appropriate use of state power to tell people what drugs they can consume, what drugs they can purchase, what drugs they can sell. Uh, and as we've seen, the sort of secondary harms of prohibition just vastly outweigh any possible benefit that we receive
Hmm.
from these policies, not just in the sphere of adulteration and misrepresentation, right? In the suppression of religious liberty, right? I mean, there was a rabbi in Denver who was using psilocybin as part of his practice. I believe very sincerely. I do not think this was in any way performative. I think this was a sincere religious belief. Who was arrested and ultimately, I don't believe,
Did
went to
not.
jail, but had to spend. Oh, he did not. Perfect. Good to hear. I thought that was my
Yeah.
understanding, but spent a tremendous amount of money defending his religious beliefs. And in this country, you should not have to raise money to defend your religious beliefs from government interference. That is a very core principle of this country. And I cannot imagine any world in which a adult using psilocybin as part of their religious practice is somehow more harmful than a person raising their child to be like a young earth creationist, right? The harm to the world from the second act is far greater than the harm to the world of the first. And yet you would never hear an American politician suggest using police power to like seize these children and force them into public education, where realistically they would receive a far better education than they are from somebody who's teaching them that Satan hid dinosaur bones during the flood or something, whatever the current narrative is from these young earth creationists, who clearly don't read Hebrew, right? Because if you read Hebrew and you read Genesis, there is just no question that is this is not, it was never intended as a literal story. Like that is textually clear from the evidence. This was meant as metaphor and allegory and storytelling, right? I mean, it was storytelling around our innate desire as humans to have a narrative of where we come
So
from.
maybe if we could talk about storytelling a little bit for a second. We're other than like the story of Dance Safe and all of the information about the organization that you are stewarding will be available for people to check out. I really wanted to get your read specifically about um, the holiday of Purim and um, the mitzvah, the obligation of drinking, and at the same time, the other voices that are trying to mitigate or reduce harm in this particular ritual ecstatic act. So I'm sure that you have thought about some of this before, and I'm wondering
Yeah.
like where is your mind to this these days?
So first, I want to tell my favorite Kabbalistic story about Purim I've ever heard, and then we can dive in deeply. So I had a rabbi in Israel who would often sort of drop little pieces of Kabbalistic knowledge, even though that's not really supposed to happen until you're much, much older than I was at the time and have studied the
Yeah,
Torah
they've
much more
paused that.
deeply.
It's all good now.
Um, it does seem to all be gone.
Yeah.
It does seem to be that, like, I mean, when you can buy the Zohar on Amazon, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like where's the line here, right? I mean, books used to be a controllable thing, and now that is just not the case anymore. Uh, and he told me that there was a secret meaning to the name Yom Kippur, which is that the real name of Yom Kippur is Yom Kippurim. It's a day like Purim, a day almost as holy as Purim. And the main sort of narrative of Purim is that you are supposed to become so intoxicated that you lose the narrative, right? You can no longer tell the difference between the good guy and the bad guy in the story, and that is the commandment, is to become that um, intoxicated. And the reason is that at its heart, Judaism, although started as monolateralist and became monotheistic, much of Judaism is actually non-dualistic, right? The Shema does not read in Hebrew as a claim of monotheism. It claims as a read of non-duality. God is one, not there is only one God, right? You could say that in Hebrew, and that is not what the Shema says. The Shema says God is one. And at one point I asked a rabbi about this, because I had studied Hinduism in high school, and so I was worried I was imposing this sort of like
Mm-hmm.
Advaidantic, misread on the Shema. And I asked him, to me, the Shema now reads more and more as a claim of non-duality, not a claim of monotheism. And I'll never forget, he didn't say Mitchell, he said Moshe. So there's Moshe Aron is my other
Okay.
name. And he said, Moshe, how could anything exist outside of the infinite? Like, what do you think infinite means? And so on Purim, we're supposed to live our lives most of the year, 364 days out of the year, as if things like good and evil are real, as if mitzvot are real, as if prohibitions are real. But one day a year, we are commanded to become so altered that we remember the ultimate truth, which is God is one. But that's just not a useful way of navigating the world, right? Like living these non-dualistic Advaidantic communities in India, you're only allowed to join them once you've had a family
Mm-hmm.
and had a child, right? You can't, as a young person, move into these Shaivite sadhu Advaidantic communities, because once you do, you're not navigating the world anymore. You are just living in godhood, God mind. And so, yeah, that's my favorite story about Purim.
That's a beautiful story about Purim. And so in there, you mentioned there's this, um, the commandment for drinking on Purim does not necessarily come from the Book of Esther itself, although drinking is I think the main character of the story, but something actually from the Babylonian Talmud. I believe it's in the Masechet, the Tractate of Megillah, and the it opens up with a statement and says, "A person is obligated to become intoxicated on Purim until they are so intoxicated that they don't know how to distinguish between a saying of which is cursed is Haman, cursed is the main antagonist, the like you said, the bad guy of the story, and the saying blessed is Mordechai, one of the heroes of the story." So that's where that idea comes. Chayav inish livasume. A person is obligated to drink that much until the binary of good, evil, Mordechai, Haman melts away.
Yeah, and there's more and more evidence now of psychedelic use within the ancient world, right? The Eleusinian Mysteries now is entirely uncontroversial. That's a maybe 4-hour boat ride from Haifa, right? We are not talking massive distances. There's evidence of psychedelic use within ancient Egyptian culture, uh, particularly their mystery schools probably used high dose lotus or maybe some sort of ergot preparation. And I know this is a really controversial belief, but I think the evidence for psychedelic use within early Judaism is also quite strong. Uh, yeah, I one of the biggest pieces to me is the showbread, right? This bread that the high priest would consume within the Holy of Holies to commune with God, uh, which in Hebrew, bread of faces is like another valid sort of way that you can read that. Like, I can't think of a better description of a psychedelic cracker than the bread of faces. Like, that's just like, yep, that's what I would call that psychedelic cracker. And I believe it is in Deuteronomy, uh, where if a woman is accused of adultery, she is taken to the temple and given the threshings of the showbread, right? The sort of stuff on the floor from when you made the showbread. And if she is innocent of adultery, she will have this transcendent vision of uh, angels. Although I think they're angels is the English translation. I think they're actually the I forget the name, the chair that Ezekiel,
Yeah,
right?
the
Not that it's
Merkava.
not a
Yeah.
living. Yeah, yeah. And if she's guilty, her limbs will turn dark and she'll die, which is a description of ergot poisoning, right? And this is not like in some sort of like in the Talmud or in the Midrashim. Like, this is core textual Torah description of ergot poisoning from somebody consuming the showbread. Uh, I also further think that the showbread was widely used by all Jews before the Hezekiah reforms, right? His attempt to centralize worship within the priesthood. I think is when the use of this psychedelic sacrament was sort of like phased out of Judaism. I think it's why he destroyed all of the other temples, because they knew how to make the bread of faces, or another better translation than showbread is the bread which shows, right? So the bread that can show you, the bread that we are explicitly told priests would consume in the Holy of Holies to speak directly to Hashem, right? I mean, to speak directly to God. Uh, and the story of Purim reads to me as, first of all, a much older tradition than the Persian cultural narrative, which was imposed on top of it. Right. I think that the way folklorists study folklore is really useful in this context, where you don't look at the names of the characters, you don't look at the claimed time and place, because those change, right? But the larger sort of narrative structure of stories is how folklorists classify folklore. Because obviously, if I was telling a story to a child now, I likely would not set it in ancient Persia, right? I would set it at their high school. And so these stories change over time. We're seeing this with Yucca Mountain, where we're storing our radioactive waste that's going to last for maybe millions of years, where they're talking to folklorists about how do we create cultural narrative, not specific language, not specific imagery, cultural narrative to describe that area as dangerous, because we need it to become folklore, because it's going to survive far longer than English will survive as a language. It will be radioactive hundreds of thousands of years after English is no
I
longer
heard that
around.
one of those ideas was also to institute like a nuclear priesthood in order to yeah.
Yeah, religion and folklore, right? Or genetically modified cats with glowing eyes, and then creating cultural stories about glowing cats being dangerous is a real proposition, and from a federal government document. That's a real thing. It's like, we'll genetically engineer glowing eye cats. We will make sure they all live near Yucca Mountain, and then that cultural narrative around glowing eye cats guarding dangerous places will survive beyond language. And so I think the story of Purim is an older story. I think it is a psychedelic remnant of Judaism's psychedelic history. Um, and if you haven't read The Immortality Key, which is about how Christianity likely began as a psychedelic mystery school, I think I loved the book. I think the author did a great job. And I don't think this was an oversight. This was a matter of focus, right? Because it's already a pretty large, dense read. But I think one of the things that would have really been good to mention is that Jesus was not introducing this idea of a psychedelic sacrament from outside Judaism. The Galilee is one of those areas where Asherah worship persisted, where there were small temple cults that Hezekiah never controlled. And I think the broad use of a psychedelic sacrament within Judaism survived in the Galilee into that period. And I think Jesus and Mary were reintroducing this psychedelic sacrament that had only been wiped out a few hundred years before, right? I mean, I forget the exact years Hezekiah was around, but it was less than a millennia, right? It was within a millennia of the lifetime of Jesus. Uh, and we see this like in the New Testament, where in Roman and Jewish law, a claim to be divine would be charged as blasphemy. But Jesus was not charged with blasphemy. He was charged with sorcery. Do you happen to know the Koine word for, like, the Koine Greek term for sorcery, the actual charge that Jesus
I
faced?
had to do a pass fail for my Koine class. So yeah.
Yeah. It's pharmakia,
Pharmakia, of course.
right? And so I think that Purim is a psychedelic myth, a psychedelic story that was rewritten. Because clearly the story is about ancient Persia, right? It's after the exile, I
Hmm.
believe. It's quite late in Jewish history, but that's not really the relevant data point, because stories change in their cultural context all the time. And this underlying idea that as Jews, we are commanded once a year to become so dissolved within this altered state of consciousness that we no longer can tell the story between, or no longer tell the difference between uh, cursed is the bad guy and blessed is the good guy, to me does not feel like an alcoholic tradition. That does not feel to me like a tradition that grew out of drinking culture, because most of these mystery schools used some version of an ergot wine, right? And so with an ergot-based wine, functionally LSD wine, little less safety margin, but not terrible. Uh, Becoming that altered is actually quite easy, as most of us know, right? If you take just a little too much of that ergot derivative, getting to a place where you are no longer able to follow the plot of a story is quite easy. Whereas with alcohol, it's not, right? I mean, alcohol has a sort of different vibe. Uh, Now, do I have any way of proving this? This is again a storytelling, right? Do I have any way of proving this history? I think at some point we will probably find direct evidence of psychedelic use within ancient Israel. We will dig up a certain pot. We'll run chemical analysis on the inside of that pot, which is quite common now. Archaeochemistry is a growing field that often uses some of the same tools that DanSafe uses for drug checking, right? The Bruker Alpha FTIR that we use for drug checking is actually quite useful for archaeochemistry. Um, it's a it's a sensitive piece of technology. It'll pick up very small amounts of things on the inside of a pot.
Well, certainly, cannabinoids have been found in an altar. Um,
Right, cannabinoids. The fact that the burning bush is a plant with a huge amount of DMT, and that Syrian Rue, which has an MAOI, is also native to the area and spoken about as a medicinal special plant. Uh, you could absolutely make an ayahuasca equivalent using only plants that grow within walking distance of the Temple Mount. That is undeniably true. Like, you could absolutely do that. And if you burned both of them in an enclosed space, the addition of Syrian Rue as an MAOI would likely mean that you would not need to extract the DMT from the acacia in order to experience its smoked effects.
so maybe, Mitch, let me ask you, because I don't get to have this conversation very often. All of this kind of root history work and these speculative hypotheses about the potential for um, hallucinogenic psychedelic compounds being used in early cultures that have grown into Abrahamic faiths such as ours. Why does it ultimately matter, versus saying, like, I have a box of drugs that I know work. I don't really need it to show up in my root source tradition. So, I'm seeing like a lot of energy and interest and excitement, not just from you, but to others. And I often am, uh, I'm intrigued, but also, that I don't need that. So can you tell me, like, why do you think that matters?
Yeah, so I have a twofold answer. The first is that I guess I don't. Right? Altered states of consciousness from non-drug sources are real. People have spontaneous mystical experiences, which I think is probably somehow related to endogenous NN-DMT or 5-MeO-DMT. But that's just to say that every thought, feeling, emotion that we have is a drug experience within our brain, right? Our brains generate consciousness
I'm
through
having a serotonin trip right now.
right. And so we are the ape that sees drugs, or however you want to phrase it. And so the fact that non-ordinary states of consciousness are part of Judaism is undeniable, right? There is simply no way to read Ezekiel as anything other than a non-ordinary state of consciousness. There's no way to read the narrative of the Exodus and the wanderings through the desert as anything other than a non-ordinary state of consciousness, because that is a 7-day walk, right? Like, that it is not a 40-year experience in the desert. That is a metaphorical description of a tremendous amount of time spent in search of a goal, right? It is a description of a non-ordinary state of consciousness around yearning and longing for home and for a place in which to be safe as yourself. Whether those non-ordinary states of consciousness that became Judaism were potentiated by outside drugs or by inside ones, right, through other means, I don't think is actually super important. I do think it's true. Like, I think that drugs were a part of it. I think the evidence around the showbread and the acacia being so clearly delineated as an important part of the Exodus, the pillar of fire, the burning bush, like these, the fact that the burning bush is the highest concentration of DMT outside of the New World, I think those are unlikely to be accidents, right? That they just picked this random tree for no reason as being so important, connecting it with burning, connecting the burning with connection with Hashem. Like that just seems really unlikely to be an accident to me. That feels like a thing that is trying to preserve knowledge around the importance of that plant and its connection to burning it and in non-ordinary states of consciousness. Uh, and so, yeah, I think it's true whether or not it's important. But there is one small context in which I think it may be important, and that is this sort of growing narrative that I think is appropriate and I think is real around cultural appropriation and respecting the cultural history of psychedelic using communities as we as predominantly sort of white Westerners, I don't actually think Jews are white in the real meaning of the term, but we are part of this white cultural milieu, which involves exploitation of indigenous community. It involves, financial taking from indigenous community. And so the fact that there are like hundreds of indigenous tribes that have a relationship with psilocybin, and now like white owned Western pharmaceutical companies are trying to patent and control it, does not sit well with me. There's a million psilocybin analogs. By all means, research those. Right, I have no issue at all with that. There's some that are literally pro drugs. I mean, 4-ASO-DMT converts into psilocin within your liver, and so like yeah, by all means. But to simply take this thing, which most famously among the Mazatec is a survived tradition that dates back thousands of years before Christianity and perhaps before Judaism, right? We might be talking about a cultural practice that predates Judaism, which is real hard to process because like we've been around for a while, and then to take that and remove it from that context and exploit it commercially, I don't love. And so I think that from that perspective alone, it really makes sense to look really seriously at the potential psychedelic histories of our own traditions, and see if those are things that we can connect with outside of the sort of exploitation and appropriation of indigenous psychedelic practices. So like I have personally never consumed ayahuasca. I've consumed pharmawaska. I've taken DMT and synthetic MAOIs. I actually used a harmaline derivative drug that exists within medical markets. Uh, you also don't purge. Like the purging is primarily because of plant tannins, and I don't like throwing up. So like that was another sort of direct benefit to just creating a pharmaceutical preparation that was a similar drug experience. But the fact that you could walk into the hills between Jerusalem and Hebron, you could walk on the land where Abraham is buried and gather plants and cook them into a tea that would provide the same drug combination as ayahuasca. Why would we not just choose to connect with that, right? With our indigenous homeland, has the same plants. There's very strong evidence that our ancestors engaged with those plants in a way that was designed to alter consciousness. Whether or not they did, clearly the non-ordinary states of consciousness themselves are really core to what Judaism was in those days, right? The whole sort of even after the Hezekiah reforms, right? The fact that the high priest on the holiest day went into a secret place to alter his consciousness, right? Explicitly described as altering his consciousness. The veil would rend and he would speak directly to God. Right? I mean, the veil would part, I guess is probably a better term. So rending was from when the Christian
a different story.
story, but the veil would part, right? The veils would open and he would see God. Like this is so hard for me to think of as something other than a psychedelic experience, even if there were no psychedelics involved, right? In the same way that we have these people who have non-ordinary states of consciousness naturally, are still really helped by the growing narrative around psychedelic integration, right? Because even if you didn't take a psychedelic and you have this, am I allowed to talk about this? I am allowed to talk about this. So I know somebody who I will not out by name because part of their practice is secret, but they do psychedelic integration psychotherapy. That is a thing they do publicly. The thing they do secretly is help people who have been traumatized by the experience of alien abductions. They've experienced psychological trauma because of this repeated abductee experience that they undergo. And when I asked them what connection they saw between those two spheres of work, because it felt really strange to me that those were the two things that they were really passionate about.
Indeed.
And they said to me that the connection is that with both cases, it doesn't actually matter if the experience that changed you is capital R real or not, right? If you have a really scarring psychedelic experience, you get tackled by the police or even just internally, right? You go into this like negative spiral and you have this really dark night of the soul psychedelic experience. Is it helpful when you go talk to a therapist if they're like, you just took a drug, it's fine? Right? Like, no, of course not. That's the whole reason psychedelic integration therapy exists now, because that was the narrative, and it's not helpful. It doesn't help these people who've been harmed. And they said that's the same case with these UFO abductees, right? It doesn't matter if it's capital R real or not. The trauma is real. The experience is real in the sense that you experienced it. Right? In the same way that, like, just because your visit to hell happened while you were like in a tent at a festival, right? And your body was in that tent at that festival. You didn't go to hell. It doesn't matter. Like it was real to you, and the trauma was real to you.
Yeah.
And so whether or not this is a drug experience that we're describing in early Judaism or not, in that sense doesn't matter. The altered states of consciousness were real, and they were a real part of what we now call Judaism, what we now practice as Judaism. This idea that you have an obligation to move through the world in ethical ways is one that you often see grow out of people's psychedelic experiences, right? This deep connection to others in the world, and this recognition that there's a famous story about Babaji, Ram Dass's guru. It's actually attributed to several different people, but I think Babaji is most likely, where somebody asked him, how should we treat others? And the answer was, there are no others. Right? There are no others. There's only us. There's only this one thing unfolding. There is only this one present moment, right? There is no actual place that is the future or place that is the past. It's why I fundamentally do not believe time travel will ever be possible, because there is no past to go to. Time is inexorably linked with space. We are moving through time in a sense that, like, we have a narrative of past, present, and future, but in reality, the only thing that actually exists is right now. And, like, boy, have psychedelics shown me that, like, in just the most powerful ways. And that idea that, like, there is no past to go to, there is no future, there is only now, also shows up in Judaism. Our understandings of the Messianic age, right, is part of the reason that Jews broadly simply did not accept Jesus as the Messiah in first century Palestine. Because if he had been the Messiah, we would be living in the Messianic age. That is what it would mean for the Mashiach to come, is that it is a fundamental shift in the now. And if that shift hasn't happened, the Mashiach has not come. And so, this is why, some Jews certainly converted. Most of the early Christians were former Jews. But I think it's part of why Christianity found so much more success outside of the Jewish world than inside, is because of this shift that was occurring within the understanding of what it means for the Mashiach to have come. And it worked within a pagan context. And I don't mean that as a pejorative, I just mean it as a descriptor of the communities. It worked within a pagan context that simply did not work within a Jewish context. That understanding feels very psychedelic to me.
Well, then I want to bring you to the second part of this part of the Talmud. first the statement about the obligation to getting drunk, but then there is a story. So there's the halacha, there's the law code that is given, but then there is an agadah. There's a story that follows it, and the story goes as follows: Rabbah and Rabbi Zera, right, two rabbinic comrades, they were preparing a Purim feast with each other, and they became intoxicated to the point that Rabbah arose and murdered Rabbi Zera. The next day, when he became sober and he realized what he had done, Rabbah asked God for mercy and revived Rabbi Zera. He brought him back from death. The next year, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zera, let the master come and let us prepare the Purim feast with each other. And Rabbi Zera said to him, miracles do not happen each and every hour. So, this kind of, to me, this feels like the core harm reduction text that we find maybe not only in Purim, but maybe all of Judaism, that we don't rely on miracles. And what do you see as the relationship between the two parts of this passage in the Talmud? First, the way that you were describing not only the obligation to drink on Purim, but this kind of psychedelic ethos that is commingled with Judaism, if not at the heart of Judaism itself, and then kind of contained by this story about what happens in reality when we start to actually put this into policy, and how we then have to navigate relationships, real harm, potential death. And I guess the only way to bring someone back from death itself is a supernatural revival. How do you feel about this second half of the story?
Yeah. So before answering those two things, I do just want to note that feels again like a coded message around psychedelic dissolving and reforming, right? This idea that they got so altered that he died and then revived seems again to be one of those coded hints around what psychedelics can do, right?
Well, he was murdered. Rabbah murdered him,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
then
I mean,
prayed
if
for
you
him to
feed
come
someone
back. Yeah.
if you feed a person a super powerful psychedelic and they experience death, how would they frame that within the psychedelic space,
Aha,
right?
I see. I see.
Yeah, he was murdered and then came back. Yeah, one of the early Christian communities that there's really strong evidence for psychedelic use around. The phrase that they would have like over doorposts is, "If you die before you die, you won't die when you die." Right, so this idea of like experiencing death allows you to better navigate when it happens. But yeah, I think that is a clear message around harm reduction as well, right? If you do a thing and experience significant harm because of it, you don't get to keep doing it under the excuse of I survived. Right, like I lived, so it's okay, right? I lived, so it's okay that I, had to be intubated, or I lived, so it's okay that I was running around throwing bricks through windows, or I mean, these are all things that I've like watched happen, right? I've seen someone in a deep sort of state of psychedelic distress, like smashing windows in a parking lot at a festival. Like that was a real thing that I had to help navigate the person, because like, how do you approach this person without putting yourself in physical danger, right? I mean, this is a person who is experiencing something clearly very terrifying and is trying to defend themselves. So how you like navigate with that person. uh yeah, I think that as Jews we have not only an obligation to repair the world and to provide harm reduction services, uh despite what the law may say. I also think as individuals, we have an obligation to learn to use drugs safely if we want to use them, right? You don't get to be cavalier about your own safety within Judaism. um uh Pikuach nefesh is more than just an obligation to save other lives. It is a moral principle that life itself is worth saving, and that includes you, right? Like your life is also worth saving. You can also violate mitzvot to save your own life, right? I need to drive to the hospital on Shabbos. I think I'm having a heart attack. Like you can get in that car and drive. It is totally fine to do that. It is not just saving another life. It is saving life. Uh, and so if you are a a Jew who uses drugs, and I tend to extrapolate Jewish moral principles out to the world at large, but that's probably not super appropriate. But I'll speak as a Jew. Uh, I do think we have an obligation to be careful and conscientious and intentional about how we move through the world, whether that involves drugs or not. Right? You don't get to not wear your seatbelt and speed as a Jew. That is a violation of the moral principles by which we are commanded to live, um, or by which our ancient communities have chosen to live. If you know, like me, you believe these things are developed, not revealed. Uh, you don't get to be selfish in that way, right? Because that is fundamentally a sort of selfish attitude. I will live my life however I want, and if I die, I die. Uh, that's selfish. It's selfish not just in the sense that like somebody's going to have to deal with you, right? If you do die, you're creating trauma in the world if you die that way. But also because we have a larger obligation to heal the world. And just like within harm reduction, keeping someone alive until they want to change their drug use is the first sort of principle of harm reduction, right? You often hear like, oh, get them into treatment. It's like, no, keeping them alive with Narcan means someday they may choose to enter treatment. They're never going to make that choice if they die. So our first step is to keep people alive until they want to change. And the first step to fulfilling our obligation to heal the world is being here to heal the world, right? If you engage in really risky behavior and it ends your life, you have ended your ability to engage within Tikkun Olam. You've ended your ability to heal the world around you, and have in many ways violated that principle. You have violated that commandment by not staying around until you couldn't anymore. Uh, and you know, it's a painful subject. Like I've had many friends who've passed away from drugs. I have friends who've volitionally ended their own lives. And I don't think either one of those are mine to judge, right? How those people made those choices. Speaking for myself, this is an obligation I believe I have, right? Is to be careful enough, to be conscientious enough around how I engage with substances, how I engage with the world, that I can continue to be in the world and I can continue to do my best to heal the world, to repair the world, to leave the world better than I entered it. Because, yeah, you know, like we started off this conversation saying, thoughts and prayers is a sin within Judaism. We don't get to say like, it's okay, Hashem will fix it. Like that's not how it works. He fixed it, you know, again, within this cultural narrative, the way in which God fixed the world was by giving it to us to steward. That was the moment where God fixed the world, is he gave it to humanity. And now it's ours with all that entails. And, you know, I see a lot of ways in which, you know, at this moment in time, it feels strange not to talk about how little I'm seeing around Tikkun Olam within my Israeli friends, right? This idea that we have, or the Kol Nefesh, right? This idea that we have an obligation to protect life, an obligation to heal the world. And I've lost a lot of Israeli friends by reminding them that that obligation does not exist only when politically easy. That is an obligation that exists at all times. And I do fundamentally believe that people have a right to defend their lives from aggression. I do not believe that that right extends to causing harm to those who are not trying to harm you. And that the ways in which, I mean, I wanted to make a T-shirt that said "I hated Bibi before it was cool" because it's so true. But the ways in which I'm seeing Likud
I
behave,
think most Israelis would probably buy that. You have a big market. Yeah.
you know, look, I marched against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, what did that do? Right? Like, it happened. I marched in Israel at Rabin memorial rallies with hundreds of thousands of other of Israelis. Right? I mean, some of these rallies in the early 2000s were huge number. I mean, a substantial percentage of the population was at some of these Rabin memorial rallies. I am not extrapolating this out to Israelis at large, but what I'm saying is that these obligations, if they don't exist when they're hard, they don't exist. And that applies to things like geopolitical defense as much as it applies to drugs that we have an individual problematic relationship with. There are I have absolutely no attraction to opiates. I have never craved numbness. The times I've tried opiates, I found them to be boring. And when I stopped taking them, like I had a knee injury and a foot injury and a dog bite. I've had several large injuries in my life where I was prescribed opiates. And when I reached the end of my script, I stopped and I never had a single craving for additional opiates. Stimulants, I have to be careful around my relationship with. And it would be in many ways easy to not be careful with that relationship, right? Like just burn the candles at both ends. I got a lot to do. My to-do list is always growing. Like I love the way they make my brain twitch. It would be very, very easy to be cavalier with that relationship. And so that's where that obligation, right? Pekuah nefesh comes not from when it's easy, but from when it's hard. And so, yeah, our obligation to save life starts with us, because you're not saving any other lives if you're not here. And so Pekuah nefesh begins as the individual and then spreads from the individual to society as a whole, starting with our own community, simply because I believe it's where we are most effective at engaging within these principles, right? But my belief in Tikkun Olam does not stop at the borders of my nation. It doesn't stop at the end of my family first, right? My Tikkun Olam does not stop at my family. It does not stop at my community. It does not stop at the borders of my nation. It does not stop at my species, right? It is a top to bottom obligation to minimize harm. It is a call for harm reduction in the grandest sense, all the way down to, I forget which midrash it's from, but this obligation that, like, if you must kill an animal, you have to do so as painlessly as possible, right? All of the laws around kashrut, like
Shchita, yeah.
Thank you. Right, literally the most painless way in which to take an animal's life is the way in which we are commanded to take their life. Which, if you think about the ancient world, is really astonishing. Right? I mean, that is really astonishing that Judaism was thinking about minimizing harm to animals needed to survive 3,500 years ago. Like, that is a narrative that still barely exists within the world. And yet it was a core part. You cannot eat this animal if it was killed in a way which caused it needless pain. You are forbidden from consuming it if it was made to suffer before it died. To me, that makes clear that these obligations don't end at any arbitrary division. There is no point at which we get to draw a line and say, on this side of the line, those living creatures are worthy of life and worthy of our efforts to reduce our harms to them. And on the other side of that line, those creatures are not worthy of that. It doesn't even end at living beings. I mean, to me, it's an obligation to literally heal the world, right? If you're going to extract resources from the world, we are required to do so in a way that is we minimize the harms of that behavior. It's not a prohibition on taking an animal's life. It's not a prohibition on extracting resources. It's not a prohibition on existing within the world. It is a principle that, because our mere existence impacts the world, we have to shape our existence in a way that our benefit to the world outweighs the harm we have caused, because we cannot, it's not harm elimination. Like, harm elimination is not a term that exists, right? It's harm reduction. We are required to reduce the harms that we cause, top to bottom, not just around drug use, not just around sexual practices, not just around protecting our hearing. In everything we do, from how we eat to how we navigate relationship, to how we navigate political life, to how we navigate resource extraction, to how we navigate our own decisions, our own minds, our own bodies. We must, as Jews, do everything we can in all of those spheres to maximize benefit and reduce harm. And that's
Mm.
really beautiful. Like, that's a really beautiful way of thinking about our place within the world, our place within reality, uh, is that we don't choose to be here, but once here, we can choose to make sure that we're a net gain to this thing, this ever present now that exists.
Well, in the voice of, in somehow the voice of Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, who opened up the guide to the perplexed in a most similar way, right? The entire effort of the law is to maintain and preserve the life of the individual and the community. I want to thank you, Mitchell Gomez, Moshe Aharon, for your
My
life.
parents had high hopes.
Absolutely, brotherly love within you. Um, thank you for your service to yourself, to your communities, your spheres of impact, and for this blessed world, this gift to preserve.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was always really great talking with you. I feel like we never get quite as much time as I wish we had. So maybe someday we'll if I ever feel comfortable going back to Israel. I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but I very much miss it, and very much someday would like to stand in front of the Kotel again.
Hopefully, shoulder to shoulder. Bezrat Hashem.